Hi everyone. If you're watching this video, chances are you're either someone I work with or a friend of mine, but if you are just stumbling upon this looking to learn more about the GRE, then welcome. My name is Mark. A little bit about myself and why I'm making these videos to start off. I took the GRE a little over 2 years ago and I scored very well and I started tutoring the test. And since then I've worked with well over 100 students. And the biggest problem I run into is just that there isn't a lot of good free resources out there for the test. A lot of them are either subscription based or things that you need to pay for, which all of those resources are great, but I would prefer there be something out there that I can point my students to and say, here, this is a good series or a good guide to walk you through the test. And since it doesn't exist, I figured I would make it myself. In this video, we aren't going to be looking at any of the content areas on the test. We're just going to focus on the logistics of the test and the frequently asked questions that I get from new students, and really questions that you ought to ask yourself before you even decide to go down this path and study for and take the GRE. So to begin with, let's ask, do I need to take the GRE? Which seems like a silly question, but from my experience, there are some people out there who don't realize that the school that they're applying to doesn't need the GRE, doesn't take the GRE, that there might be a different test that they should be taking, or that they've taken it already and their scores are already good enough, though they didn't realize it. So the first thing you should do is check with your admissions office. Now, this can look like going on the website and really digging into the details there, or it can mean making a phone call or sending an email because different schools, they don't always reveal all their information on their website, and often the things that are said on the website can be more or less guidelines as opposed to actual rules. So contacting the admissions office can be pretty important. Some of the things to think about are, what scores do I need? So a lot of websites, a lot of admissions office websites will list cutoffs, uh, which if they are listed as a cutoff, you should treat them as such. But sometimes they list medians, and medians are very different. So the median means where the 50th percentile of students at that school scored, which means there's a decent chunk of students who scored less than that. So obviously you want to score as well as you can to be competitive, but if you're in and around the median but you're not quite there, it might not be the best use of your time to be retaking the test just to try to hit that if the rest of your application looks strong already. Another thing that you ought to be concerned about is, do I need all three sections of the test? So the GRE contains three sections: the analytical writing, the verbal reasoning, and quantitative reasoning. For most programs that just say they need the GRE, they are looking at all three. But from my experience, a decent number of schools don't really care about the analytical writing. They care more about personal statements, writing samples from your undergrad, and things like that. And the analytical writing score, that 0 to 6 score, doesn't really mean much to them. The other caveat is that certain programs, if they're extremely quant focused or extremely verbal focused, they don't really care about your composite score so much as just one subject score. And in some cases, they will just completely ignore the other one. So for a particular engineering degree, they might not even look at the verbal, but they have extremely high requirements for quantitative. And on the other side, similarly, for maybe something in the humanities or social sciences, verbal reasoning might be much more important than quantitative reasoning. This last point is a little more niche than the other two, and it might not apply to many of you, but if you are considering pursuing law or an MBA, you might be better served taking a different test. The benefit to the GRE is that it's accepted at a wide variety of graduate programs, and so if you're not dead set on one of those types of programs, you might want to cast a wider net with your application, and therefore the GRE would be better. However, if you are certain you're going for law, you might want to consider, should I take the LSAT instead of the GRE? The benefit to the LSAT is that there isn't any math on it. It does include logic games, but a majority of it is critical reasoning and reading comprehension. So it means you don't have to go back and relearn geometric formulas or probability equations and stuff like that. Likewise, if you're planning on going for an MBA, you have to consider, would it be better to take the GRE or the GMAT? The two tests are pretty comparable, and I would say the only way to really make a good decision about which to take is to look at practice tests of both and see which one appeals to you. The benefits to the GMAT are that it typically has an easier vocabulary, but it does test grammar, where the GRE does not. And so that usually ends up being either a big strength or a big weakness for people, and so that can often be the determining factor. The other thing is that the content is similar on both tests, but the GMAT tends to be harder for non-math people. It tends to require a bit more on the side of abstract quantitative reasoning. So once you've decided that you are going to take the GRE, the next thing to consider is how and when are you going to take the test. So the most important resource for the GRE is ets.org, which is the website where you'll sign up, and it has all of this information and much, much more, but it can be a bit daunting to sift through all that. So what I've tried to do is pull out some of the key points that I often get asked about. So first off, it is a computerized test. I know a lot of people prefer to take paper tests, and what I constantly get asked is, can I take this as a paper test? I like to be able to take notes, cross out answers, things like that. The answer is no, you are probably not going to be able to take a paper test. As far as I know, the paper test is only administered internationally in places where they don't have access to computerized testing locations. So if you're in the United States or most other countries, you are going to be taking a test is also going to cost $205 per attempt. So of course it's nice to only have to take it once or maybe twice, but it can definitely rack up if you're not doing well and you have to keep retaking it. And we'll talk about retaking in a little bit. The other thing to consider is the location, the date, and the time of your test. From my experience, and I've lived in a couple different places in the United States, and in all places, it's been pretty easy to find local test centers as long as you're near a metropolitan area or a university of some sort. You're going to find some sort of testing center that offers tests year round, most days of the week. The test times tend to be either early morning, something like around 8 a.m., or about a noon start time. So keeping in mind that the test does take several hours to complete, so you want to prepare for either an early or midday start. Next to consider is, what do I need to bring to the test? I find a lot of people have misconceptions about this part of the test. Oftentimes people are imagining the ACT or the SAT where they would go into a room with a paper test and be proctored by some teacher. It doesn't really function like that for the GRE. Oftentimes it'll be in a small room and you'll be at a little cubby with a computer of your own. And what this means is that you don't need to bring paper, pencil, calculator. All you need to bring is yourself and your identification. So your ID is very important. You will get turned down if you don't have acceptable ID, and we'll take a look at what is acceptable and what is unacceptable ID in a second. The other thing that you can bring is a snack and a drink. That will be kept outside the room and you'll be able to access it during one of your breaks. If you bring any other stuff, the test center should lock that away and you won't be able to access your cell phone or your wallet or keys during the test. The other thing to bring along, and it's not necessarily a physical thing, but you should bring along a mental list of the schools you plan on reporting to. As soon as the test is over, you'll have the option to send out 4 free reports to different schools. So it can be nice to go and look up what is the GRE code for the program you're applying to. They will have a drop-down menu there, but oftentimes a particular school might have several different departments, each with a different code. So it is good to have a mental list of what schools you plan on sending it out, because the reports will cost more money later. Here we're on the official ETS website, which is a website you want to be very familiar with, and you should definitely check it out if you plan on taking the test. There's a lot of information here. It can be difficult sometimes to dig out exactly what you're looking for, but it is worth your time. Now, of course, the one and only thing you have to bring to the computerized test is your ID, and so you definitely don't want to mess this up. If you do mess this up, if you don't have an ID that matches your exact name, you won't be able to take the test and they won't give you your money back. So a couple things. Your ID needs to be the original document, it can't be photocopied, and it has to be a government issued valid ID. It also must have your first and last name, a photograph, and a signature. I'm going to assume most people watching this are going to be taking this in the States, and if that's the case, most commonly it's going to be a driver's license or it's going to be a passport. But of course, there are other options here. If you are testing outside the United States, you can check the requirements on this dropdown. I'm not familiar with all of them, but if there's any doubt about whether or not the ID you plan on bringing is acceptable, you should definitely clear that up ahead of time with your test center to make sure. Lastly, a couple notes about retaking the test. If you've already taken it and you're taking it again, or if you're anticipating having to take it more than once, you should know that you can only take a test every 21 days. So don't schedule them too close together. Also, plan your studying schedule around that, knowing that you have these 3-week period between tests. Secondly, if you are taking this several times, know that you can only take it 5 times in a rolling year, which means from the time you take your first test, for 365 days, you can only take 5 total tests. The next thing everybody wants to know is what is on the test. So if you've gotten this far, you're already probably familiar with the GRE and what's on it, but we'll take it section by section. So there are 6 sections total on the test, and it should run about 3 hours and 45 minutes. And that's anticipating that you let all the sections go to time, as opposed to ending them early or skipping any sections. The first section is always the analytical writing. This is the essay section, and you'll be responsible for 2 essays, 30 minutes each. The 2 tasks are the issue and the argument, and we'll talk about the details in later videos. Something to consider at this point, the issue is more of a persuasive essay, whereas the argument is more of a logical essay. The next section that you might encounter is the verbal reasoning. So the 5 sections following the essays are a mix and match of verbal and quantitative. You'll either encounter 2 verbals and 3 quantitatives, or 3 verbals and 2 quantitatives. The verbal section will each have 20 questions in 30 minutes, and what's primarily being tested is your English skills, your vocabulary, and your reading comprehension. The quantitative section, as I mentioned before, you'll either see 2 or 3, depending on how many verbals you had, and you'll get 20 questions in a little bit more time, 35 minutes, and the content here is arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and data analysis. So none of the math here goes beyond a high school level. The questions can get very difficult, but you don't need to know anything like trigonometric properties or calculus and things like that. The next thing that everybody wants to know, everybody's worried about, is how is this thing scored? What is a good score? Is my score good enough for the schools I'm looking to go to? So we'll take it section by section again. The writing section is separate from the other 2 sections. It's just scored on a 0 to 6 scale, so you might get a 3 or a 4 or a 4.5 or something like that. And when a school looks at your scores, they're going to see your composite score separate from your writing score. And as I said before, it's up to them how much weight they want to give to the writing score. How it's scored by 2 separate graders. You have a human grader and a computer grader. So the human grader is just looking at your essays holistically, how well is this thing written? And we'll talk about the details later, but generally they aren't looking for spelling, grammar mistakes. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for overall quality of your writing, how well you can elucidate your thoughts. And again, we'll look at that in later videos. The verbal and quant scores are the 2 sections that are going to comprise your composite score. And so both of them are scored between 130 and 170, and so your composite is out of 340. So for instance, if a school is looking for a quant score, they might say we're looking for 150, 155, or they might just list a GRE score of 306 or 320 or something like that. So it's important to understand the difference between the 2. The other thing that I think people have a misconception about, because you're being scored based on 40 questions, it looks like it's just, oh, how many questions did I get right? That's where I fall on this 130 to 170 scale. And that's actually entirely wrong. So the way it works is that it is adaptive, which means that the first set of 20 questions you get will determine how difficult the second set of 20 questions is. So if you do very well on the first set, you're going to get a much more difficult second set. which you might not get as many right on that second set, but your score is going to come out higher because you answered more difficult questions. So it is entirely possible to go in and get the same amount of questions right as someone else, but have an entirely different score because of the way it's scaled. The other thing which you might have noticed is that I had mentioned there could be 2 verbals and 3 quants or vice versa, and that's because somewhere in your test you have an unscored section. Generally, what is going to happen is you're just going to encounter 3 quant sections or 3 verbal sections, and you won't know, but one of those was fake and it wasn't scored. There is this other situation that could happen when you get to the last section. When you are anticipating this verbal or quant section, it might tell you this is a research section, it isn't scored, and if that's the case, then you know that your first 4 sections of verbal and quant are all real, and that this last section is optional and unscored. Now I want to look at what the 50th percentiles are. So in writing, a 50th percentile score is around a 3.5. It's not exact. For verbal, it's around 151, and for quantitative, it's around 153. Now, again, this score is adaptive, which means the scores tend to resemble a bell curve or a normal distribution, which means a majority of people are going to score in and around this 150 area. A lot of people are going to score between a 145 and a 155. It's very difficult to score at the extremes on either end. So what does this mean for the application process? Again, if you've already done your research and you know what program you're applying to and you know what scores they have, this isn't for you. But if you are just taking the test and looking to throw a wide net with your applications, you might be thinking, well, what does this test mean? What do these scores mean? Where do I have a good shot of getting into? And so what I want to do now is look at a couple different schools of varying competitiveness and see what it is that they're looking for and what their listed averages are. So we're here at the Harvard Business School webpage. So let's just take a look at what one of the most competitive MBA programs will be looking for from the GRE. So typically, if you're looking at a program, what you want to do is you might need to navigate through to find the program you're looking for, and most often under admissions or application processes, they'll list their GRE scores, or in the case of competitive programs, what they'll often do is list a class profile. Um, and so if you scroll down, you usually find like a test breakdown like this. And so here we can see that a majority of people accepted are taking the GMAT, but a decent chunk, a fifth of them, have just taken the GRE. And if you look at the medians listed, it's 163 for verbal, 163 for quantitative, and both of those are very good scores. They're around the 90th percentile for verbal, around the 80th percentile for quantitative. But again, just to consider, the range of people accepted goes all the way down to 147, 145. So one of the things you want to be cautious of is that competitive programs will have high listed medians or averages, but it's entirely possible that if your application is strong, you don't need to reach that point. You can be accepted with a lower score. So here to look at something a little bit different, we have the University of Texas School of Health. And if we look at some of their programs, maybe we're interested in physical therapy, and we're interested in the admissions process. So they have some deadlines, and so we want to look at the traditional program. And there they have the GPA listed, so we can look and see, oh, okay, this is what they're looking for with GPA, and there's the GRE. And so it doesn't look like they have any sort of threshold listed. So to me, that tells me they're probably willing to look at any candidate whose application is strong enough regardless of score. Also, you can see there they have the code listed that you'll need for test day when you want to send your scores to that particular department of the University of Texas. And they also have a breakdown, and there is an average GRE score listed. Okay, so 312, that's the composite score, so we need to cut that in half, and so that's going to be 156, 156. And so 156 on quantitative and verbal are both around the 60th, 70th percentile. So nowhere near as difficult to achieve as those averages we saw on the Harvard website, but still good scores for a competitive program. So again, what your scores mean has to do with what your goals are for the programs you're looking at. Lastly, I thought I'd take a look at one more program just to sort of round off these examples. And I was looking at the Penn State College of Education, looking at some different educational or psychology master's programs. And I dug for a long time. And for this particular program, which is educational psychology, I was unable to find any threshold or median listed. The only thing I see is this right here, that they require official GRE testing scores. So what that tells me is that they need the test, but they aren't too concerned about the scores, and that the rest of your application is probably more important to them. This is one of those situations where I would recommend that if you were applying to this program, that you contact their admissions directly and ask them what are they looking for, how important is my GRE test. So here we have the official percentiles broken down by score from ETS. And these are based on the past several years, so they're fairly accurate. Things don't change too much. And you can see, as we were looking at before, right, those 160 scores are sitting in and around the 80th, 70th percentile, whereas the 150s, mid 150s, is where you have the 50th to 60th percentile. And so what you should consider is that for a majority of programs out there, scoring above 50th percentile, scoring in the mid 150s is good enough. However, if you want to be really competitive, you're going to have to push your score a little bit higher. Again, a good score is dependent entirely on your own goals. So make sure you set realistic goals, but of course push yourself to be as competitive with your test scores and application as possible. So if you are now thinking the GRE is for me, I need to take this, I need to do well, I hope you will continue with these videos. I'll be attempting to break down the test into its basic components and provide you with a well-rounded, easy to follow guide for the entirety of the test. So, thanks again for watching, and I hope you'll check out the rest of the series.